Welcome. Thank you for attending tonight's Your Child and Healthy Relationships webinar. We're so glad you're here. I'm Eliza, the Sexual Violence Prevention Coordinator with SARNCO, the Sexual Assault Response Network of Central Ohio, or Franklin County's Rape Crisis Center. I'm joined today by Julie Sespico of the Center for Family Safety and Healing. If you need to process any of the subjects discussed tonight, or if you have more in-depth questions, if you're looking for resources for yourself or for your family, feel free to call the Ohio Health Sexual Assault Response Network of Central Ohio's helpline. It's open 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, and the phone number is 614-267-7020. We've also created a document with all the various school districts' contact information for you. To access it, just scan the QR code on your screen. Again, welcome to the seminar. Julie, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Eliza. So I'm Julie Sespico. I am a training coordinator with the Center for Family Safety and Healing at Nationwide Children's Hospital. So our center is known as the Child Advocacy Center for Franklin County, helping children who are experiencing abuse, especially sexual abuse. And then we also have services for adults who are experiencing domestic violence and relationship abuse. And there's a lot of work that we also get to do as part of that, where we talk with young people in middle schools and high schools about healthy relationships and how we kind of set a vision for a healthy relationship and start to identify what might be more unhealthy relationship behaviors that can sometimes be normalized. So a lot of my work is talking with middle schoolers and high schoolers all around the Central Ohio area. And you can imagine that that is a very fun job. And I learn a lot from the students that I talk with. So I'm going to bring in some of that knowledge and just the wisdom that the young folks have shared with us into this conversation today. So we're talking about consent, and this can start out as a really simple definition that consent is a voluntary, informed yes. I personally think of consent as a gift we can give each other. It's something that can build trust and connection. But before we get into all that, we're gonna just kind of share some small examples of what consent can look like in our everyday lives. So we see consent show up in a lot of different ways. I think our society kind of talks about consent as only this one thing pertaining to this one very specific area, that maybe consent is something that is kind of only to avoid consequences, or, you know, it's this kind of avoidance of negative legal consequences or something like that. But we're going to show how consent is actually really a part of our normal everyday lives. And we'll dive in a little bit more to that here in a minute. So looking at consent, this might be things like medical consent, where we have consent to treat forms. That's a really normal thing we fill out at the doctor's office almost every time, it seems. Normal consents in everyday life could look like parent slips, parental field trip permissions, things like that. That's a normal consent thing that happens all the time. We look at some like legal consents, or there might be things with, even just when we're making plans with our friends or family, where we might say, hey, do you like this restaurant? Do you these are the plans I was thinking about. How does that sound to you? When we have to consider a restaurant, my dad has celiac disease, and we have to really check, hey, does this restaurant fit your needs? Are they celiac friendly? Will they prepare your food in a safe way? So just those little check-ins of consent we do all the time. And then what we're really going to focus on today, so not this big scary kind of consent, but normalizing that. What we're going to focus on today is the consent around touch. And we're going to look at, these kind of everyday consents around that. Could be, may I take your picture? That's something that we don't automatically assume we can do. That's a normal thing we might ask. Hey, I took these pictures of us when we were out yesterday. Do you mind if I post this picture of us? Often my friends will say, not that one. Let's choose a different one. That we have a little negotiation there that happens when, oh, I don't like this one. Do you like this picture? those are things that, especially our young people, are doing that constantly. So that's already a really normalized part of that process. We might ask a next step of that consent would be, can I tag you in this picture? I've certainly had friends say, you can post it, but don't put my name on there. Don't tag me in that. So you can see how it's kind of this process. First, may I take your picture? Then may I post it? Then can I tag you in it? And those are all separate consents that we give. We ask consent. I am always distracted when we're walking down the street and I see a dog and I immediately want to pet that dog. But we've learned from an early age to say, hey, is it okay if I pet your dog? And there's some really valid reasons why people might say no. Maybe they're really in a training program with their dog where they're trying to teach their dog not to approach strangers, or maybe their dog is a service animal that's working and it's not supposed to be pet right then. So it's not this big, heavy, serious consent, but that's asking consent. And then, there's these kind of consents like, I really need a vent right now. Do you have time to listen to that? I know, Eliza, we were talking a little bit about this. Do you want to share that kind of story about that vent session?
Sure. My best friend and I don't live in the same city. And so when I've had a bad day or when they've had a bad day, it's our habit to text one another and say, I really need to vent. Are you in a space where you have the bandwidth for that? Or, do you have time today where you could listen to me vent? Do you have the emotional space today to listen to me vent? Because it's been a rough day and a heavy day. And sometimes the kind of work that we do is really heavy. And I always want to respect the fact that my best friend might not have the emotional bandwidth to listen to me talk about childhood sexual assault. It's a heavy topic.
Yep.
But sometimes it's not that. Sometimes it's other things that have me completely stressed out or that they have them stressed out. So we like to share all the good things in our lives, but we also like to be there for each other when things go a little crooked. And when they do, though, we always start by checking in. And we're at a place, because we always do that, that I know I'm going to get an honest answer from them. They're going to tell me truly if they have the bandwidth to talk to me that day. And I love that because I know that I can trust them to be honest with me, to check in with their intuition and give their consent or not give their consent on that day. And I, of course, have other spaces to kind of slough off that stress and other people I can reach out to talk to. But I think it's really brought us closer in our friendship. One of the things I want to point out just really quick is that Julie and I have both been talking about adult friendships that we have, but all of this applies to your relationship with your children too. When you take a picture of your child, before you take a picture of your child, you can ask for their permission. And that's a way to model consent within your family. So there's a lot of these, although our examples might be in adult friendships or adult relationships, they're directly applicable to the children in your life as well. So yeah.
Absolutely. Thanks, Eliza. And one more doing example, and I think this is a really important one that applies to parents and children too, is knocking on a door before you go into a room. And I have talked with some parents who've kind of said, hey, this is my house, I pay the bills here, and I'm going into whatever room I want to go into. And, I have full empathy for all of the responsibility for that parent that they have on their shoulders, and keeping their family in that house is a big responsibility. But there is just a pause here, just an invitation to consider, what message could that send when you are just pausing and knocking and asking if it's okay to come into your child's room. And we're going to talk more about how that really can build this kind of sense of empowerment for that young person. I know of friends who've had their doors taken off the hinges as a kind of consequence for, not meeting curfew or something like that when they were in their teenage years. And, we've talked many times about how that can really feel disempowering and says, you don't have a right to privacy, which I think every parent that we talk with wants their children to have a sense of, hey, you're allowed to have a sense of privacy about what's on your phone with your partner or with your friends. You don't have to share your location with all your friends, or your partner doesn't need to know, every single place you visit, or there's this kind of built-in, you want your children to keep their bodies private. And so there is this strong desire for the parents I talk with that we do want to instill a sense of the right to privacy for children. And I just appreciate, Eliza, you bringing that into the space, that parents can model that for their young people too. So even simple things like knocking on the door before we enter the room, asking, is this an okay time to talk? Those are some simple things that are building onto that sense of, you're allowed to have privacy, and we're going to respect your autonomy. And so, talking through some ways that consent can look kind of broadly, what we go back to that original definition and just kind of reaffirm that consent means making sure that all the humans involved understand what's happening, that they want to take part, and know they can stop at any time. So it's, this consent is not just about, it's not a one-sided thing. It's, as Eliza was saying too, that it builds connection to have this consent process and bring this into our every kind of relationship that we have, whether it's parent to child, and for your children to bring that into their friendships, and for you to model that with your partner or your friendships or family members in front of your children. Consent plays a role in all of those dynamics. And what I really love about looking at consent this way that we see on the screen is that an important part of this is that there's a voluntary, informed, and enthusiastic yes. And another way to think of that is called empowered choice, where each person gets to have an active role in the decisions, big and small, that they have an impact on their life, that those decisions have an impact on their life. And it's a really healthy part of a human relationship dynamic. One of the things that I hear a lot from students and from adults too is, how do you build trust? Like, I want my girlfriend or boyfriend or partner to trust me more. And I think trust is really hard. I think we would all agree. Trust is really hard to build and to keep. And so one of the best ways we can build trust, and anyone can do this in any relationship dynamic, is to do these small consent check-ins, big and small, because there's this, like you said, that trust that comes from, hey, I am enthusiastically saying yes. And you've probably been in a situation where you said to a friend, hey, do you want to go to this, movie? And they kind of give you this, maybe, yeah, that's fine. And you feel this sense of like, I think that they're holding back. I think that they're not being honest about what they want. And that can drive some discord and disconnect in that friendship. So if we can normalize, hey, Eliza, I care about you. And so if I ask you, do you want to go to this movie or do this thing instead? That I really mean it. I'm really offering a choice, and I want to hear what you really want, and I'm going to honor that. And the first time Eliza says to me, no, actually, I'm not really interested in that movie, then I can say, hey, great, I'm so glad you told me. Let's look at something else that we both want to do. And then that is building onto that trust that we have with each other to say, hey, when you do say yes, I believe you. And I'm not going to question, are you sure? Are you sure? No, you gave me that consent, that yes, and that is, I'm going to trust that too. So it's both ways.
Yeah. I like that you've said that it's both ways. I think that that's really important. What we're going to do at the end of our conversation with y'all today is kind of wrap up the skills that are involved with consent. And there's the skill of knowing your own intuition of what you really want and having the agency to voice that opinion. Whether it's what you're going to have for dinner or whether or not you're going to have another child or, anything big or small or in between. It's the kind of thing that we learn as children, right? We learn as children sometimes to give ourselves away. We learn as children sometimes to do whatever's going to keep us close to the people we want to be close with. We become people pleasers. And that's not true for everyone, but it's true for a lot of people. And it's a dangerous thing, because if you don't have this idea of your own intuition and you haven't expressed using your own voice what you really do want, even in small things like what to wear to school today, what movie to see with your friend tonight, then when you're in an intimate situation with another human being, it's going to be really hard to check in with your intuition and to voice your own opinion about what you want and you don't want. So that's why we've started this conversation today with these ideas about how consent is a part of our everyday. Because at the end of our conversation, we're going to ask you to amplify how you do this, how you give the gift of consent to others, and how you check in with yourself so that you can be a model to your children and you can build within the family community, the family relationship that you have, and with your work and everything else, more consent, more opportunities to feel what really does feel like an enthusiastic yes within yourself, somatically as well as intellectually. And so that you can teach that to your child. Because I want to take a second to just say that you may never have learned this, right? Some of the things that we're going to talk about tonight might be new. And then as a parent, it gets to be the question of, if I never had this modeled for me, how do I do this for my child? And that's a great question, and it can be tricky. But the answer is, no one expects you to be perfect. It's about trying. So we hope that these next couple slides, which we're really going to kind of dig into the concepts of consent, we're going to come back to the more realistic, how do we do this in our family unit? How do I do this with my child at the end of the conversation today? But to move on to some of the basics, if you want a mnemonic, a memory aid to help you understand the true basics of what consent is, the one I learned when I first started in this work is FRIES. So the way that FRIES works is each letter stands for something, F in FRIES standing for freely given. So an easy way to remember consent, again, is to use this memory aid. F stands for freely given. So when we say freely given, we mean there's no pressure, right? There's no manipulation. It's just freely given consent. Right? They're just that lack of pressure, the ability to say honestly, yes, no, or what if we tried this? Okay, so that's F. The next one for FRIES is reversible. And this really comes down to the fact that as adults, as children, as youth, we should be able to respect the fact that someone can change their mind. There's a tea analogy video that I'm going to recommend in our resource section at the end of this conversation today. And it says basically, today I wanted a cup of tea. That doesn't mean that every day I'm going to want a cup of tea. Tomorrow I might not want a cup of tea. So that's this idea of reversible. You have choice and you can change your mind. So let's apply this to intimate interactions. If I am kissing someone right now and enjoying that, and there's consent there, that's great, but that doesn't mean that there will be consent in 5 minutes or 5 seconds. Just because I kissed someone 2 weeks ago doesn't mean even that I want to necessarily now. And so this idea of reversible is to say that just because something has been done in the past, or just because I am doing something now, doesn't mean I can't change my mind, right? And if we step back far enough, what this is also saying is that we want to give grace to whomever we're being intimate with so that they can feel they can change their mind and they can voice that change of opinion. So freely given, reversible. Next is I, informed. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this in some of the other slides, but this means that the person giving consent is of an age to give consent, and that they're not impaired. The not impaired part comes in quite a bit in my conversations with youth, meaning that if someone is drunk, they can't give consent. If someone is unconscious, they cannot give consent. So this idea of impaired is really important to the I of informed. So can you, or do you have your faculties, your wits about you? Is there an equal power dynamic between you? Can you give an informed yes? So that's the I. Let's move on. E is my favorite one. We're going to come back to this one a couple times in our conversation this evening. And enthusiastic is just the most important part of this. It's all important, but this one is, it's so important. It's not just yes, it's an enthusiastic yes, right? An enthusiastic yes. And we're going to talk more about why that's important as we move on. So freely given, reversible, informed, enthusiastic, and then finally we have not just one fry, but fries. So we've got the S for specific. So what this means is that just because I've agreed to hold your hand doesn't mean that I agree to kiss you. Just because I've kissed you doesn't mean I've given you permission to touch me. Just because I've given you permission to touch me in certain parts of my body doesn't mean I've given you full reign over my entire body, unless I've specifically said so. So it's the specificity of it that's really important. So if this is helpful, this mnemonic has helped me for over 20 years. It's from Planned Parenthood. Freely given, reversibles, informed, enthusiastic, and specific. Fries. Okay, so this is our first tip of the night. You're going to see that little light bulb icon on occasion, kind of indicating that this is a tip that we would recommend considering to use with your children. All right, so speaking of which, this one's also a tip, and part of how our brain processes information is to think in opposites. And I could prove this to you by saying, if you've ever told a child, don't touch that, it's hot, the first thing that they want to do is, of course, touch it, right? That's just what they do. And that's partly because of how our brains work, how our brains are wired. So one thing that I would recommend considering doing with your child is to make a list of what consent is not, because that can be really powerful in defining what consent is. And if you can find an example just kind of along the way of your day that you can bring up with your kid while you're loading the dishwasher, then that's even better. I know one really great time of year is Halloween, for example, because inevitably in Halloween there are sexy ghost costumes and sexy nurse costumes and lots of things we can kind of wind into our conversation that will help bring our conversation alive when we're talking with kids and adolescents. So it's an easy time to start this conversation. But what you have on this slide is a non-definitive list. It's not comprehensive. It's just a non-definitive list of what consent is not. But it's a really good tool to use. So your clothing is not in any way consent, right? Consent has to be verbalized. It is communication. So just because you have a sexy ghost costume on doesn't mean that you're welcoming everyone to flirt with you. I mean, you might want some people to flirt with you, but you're not welcoming that. You're not welcoming touch. You're not welcoming sex. You're just wearing a sexy ghost costume. That's all you're doing, right? And I think if we look at sexual violence in particular, quite often in our popular culture, it's portrayed that what you're wearing impacts your safety. But in reality, you could be wearing, jeans and a sweater. It's about power and control. It's not about what you're wearing. So I don't want to go too deep into that one, but clothing doesn't matter. It's not your clothing. Consent is not your clothing. The word maybe isn't consent, right? And the reason the word maybe isn't consent is because it's not an enthusiastic yes, right? That's why that enthusiastic yes part of fries is so important. Maybe means not right now. So maybe is a no. Maybe is potentially a yes for tomorrow or next week, but it's a no in this moment right now. So I think that's really important. An intoxicated yes is not consent because the person is not informed. They can't make that decision. Same if they're drunk. If they're drunk or if they're doing drugs. Either way, it's not like if you're drunk you can say yes, but if you're doing drugs you can't. It's that idea of not having your full faculty. Past consent isn't a yes. We talked about that, and just because we had sex 2 weeks ago doesn't mean that you're automatically going to receive my consent today. It's not some sort of blanket consent once you've had sex with someone that they'll always want to have sex with you again. Silence is not consent. I think that's really important too. Again, it's a communication. It needs to be verbalized. Flirting is not consent. Being unconscious doesn't allow for consent. We mentioned that before. Being forced or manipulated is not consent either. We're going to get into that a little bit more because I think that's probably one of the most important conversations to have with your children. But just to tie a bow on this particular slide, I want to say that forming a list of what consent is not can be super helpful and a really engaging conversation. So if you see something on TV where you're like, was that consent or was that not consent? That can be a great time to maybe do this. Or the next morning. You know, I was thinking about that show we watched last night. Do you remember that scene? To me, that wasn't consent. What do you think? And then like, hey, can we make a list of what consent is not? It can be a wonderful way to start a conversation.
Especially once you create those little consent detectives, like, because young people, and we all do, love to pick out things that are wrong,
yes.
or that they are smarter than,
It's
true.
The
show. So I love that, like creating those kind of consent detectives. And if I could just add just really quick
sure.
To that silence. We had a student one time in class who said, well, this consent might be important for other people, but I'm a body language expert. Eliza, have you ever met a body language expert?
I don't have any friends in the
Maybe,
FBI.
No. I would like to be one. But, we had kind of a good time with him, but just kind of said, like, well, okay, then what does this mean then? Like, what, all right, what am I feeling right now? He's like, that's easy. You're annoyed. I interrupted you. I could tell you got your arms crossed. That always means that somebody's mad or annoyed. And we're like, not annoyed at all. This is a good conversation to me. What else could it be? And he guessed a couple other things. And finally, one of the other students in the class is like, I know, it's very obvious. They're like, she's cold. Obviously, she's crossing her arms. Earlier, I noticed her kind of shivering. It's very clear to one student. And so we had a good time, with quizzing the body language expert, but that is kind of a thing that we think, maybe we don't articulate it so clearly that we think that about ourselves, but it is fair to sometimes assume like, oh, I'm really good at interpreting, I know this person so well, I know their nonverbal cues, I definitely can interpret what they're giving me, a yes or a no. And I just wanted to really emphasize that even when we think we know someone well, or we think a sign is really obvious, that without that verbal, enthusiastic yes, we really cannot make those assumptions. So maybe another kind of way to have conversations with your young people is to talk about, we don't really have body language experts, and talk about those kind of nonverbal cues not being consent either.
Yeah, I like that. There's always going to be a certain amount of assumption in body language interpretation, even if maybe you are an expert, right?
Sure.
And I think that too, there's just this beautiful level of caring by asking. You're kind of quiet. I just wanted to check in. Is this still okay? Right? What would you like to do next? Like, to me, and then maybe this is just me, that's kind of awesome. I would love it if someone would say something like that to me.
It's this connection building.
Yeah.
It's really, I want to emphasize, I said it earlier, but I want to emphasize, I just think so often when we hear consent talked about in the media or popular culture kind of references to consent, it always seems to be this kind of negative conversation about, oh, here's how to avoid, getting in trouble or something like that. But truly, I agree with you. I think it's such a beautiful way to build connection. And if you ever have a partner or a friend or a family member look at you and go, hey, I noticed that you seem kind of like you're pulling back, your arms are crossed, are you cold? Are you upset? Are you annoyed? That check-in, and not just assuming we understand what other people are experiencing, it's such a validating way to feel seen and cared about and brought into the relationship.
And ultimately, we all want to belong, right?
Yes.
We want to belong to each other. We want to belong to communities. And this is a way to bring ourselves closer to others in a more transparent and honest way, a genuine way. Mm-hmm. I think in this day and age, we're really longing for that. So,
Absolutely.
Yeah, it can be helpful. Thank you for bringing that in. All right. So again, with just some basics, the opposite of informed consent is power and control. And I think it's really important when we're talking about sexual violence, because when we talk about consent, we are talking about sexual violence kind of in a sideways way. And that's that sexual violence is about power and control. We don't see this in our popular culture very often, but the reality is that's what it's about. So power dynamics, I think, is just important to consider. If there's not equal power between the two people or the individuals who are engaging in an intimate act, then there cannot be consent, even if someone gives an enthusiastic yes. So some examples to kind of bring this home. The relationship between a boss and an employee, right? Which could be for adults, it could be for adolescents. Certainly a lot of our children work part-time or work in the summertime. The relationship between a boss and an employee can get close. It can get very close very quickly. But is that equal power? No, it's not. So can consent actually happen? In our definition, the answer is no, it cannot happen. Teacher and student, boss and employee, adult and child, coach and player. Those are just some examples. To think that when we think about what consent is and what it isn't, I want to just spend a few slides, spend a few moments here talking about when consent isn't possible. And one of those situations is when the power differential is off. So just an FYI on that. Here is a list of all the times when consent is not possible. And when I talk about this with adolescents, it gets pretty heavy, but they also have a lot of questions. I feel like this is one of the points when I'm talking to youth that they kind of perk up and they're like, well, what about my boyfriend? He's 20 and I'm 17. Like, is that technically he's an adult and I'm a few months away from being an adult? So this is a really generative conversation. And we focus a lot of time on unconsciousness, and I had a lot of willing youth, which I always take a moment just to be pleased that they're willing to share their themselves with me by asking very vulnerable questions. So one of the questions I got about unconscious recently at a high school was, she's my girlfriend and we have sex all the time. She wasn't unconscious when we started making out, but she is now. Like, how is that wrong? And that's such an interesting and important conversation to have, because we have to take about 15 steps backwards to really kind of set the stage for that and talk about healthy relationships. As Julie said at the beginning of our conversation tonight, it really does come down to healthy boundaries and healthy relationships and understanding what is okay and not okay. And again, this idea, just because you have had sex with people in the past doesn't mean that you have blanket approval for everything always. And just because you are in a continued intimate relationship with someone doesn't mean that you get to decide to have sex with them when they aren't even conscious. So it's interesting to have these conversations with youth. Another one that comes up a lot is the forcible compulsion. And the idea that sometimes I say yes to my partner because I know he's got guns and knives in the room and he's a very violent person. Or sometimes I say yes to my partner because when I say no to her, she becomes outrageous and says really ugly things about me at school. And that's how she gets back at me if I say no. And so I think that forcible compulsion is a really interesting one to discuss with students too, because we're getting now into the nuances. So it's important to know when consent is not possible. I want to talk very specifically about coercion and give you just a simple statistic. And when we think about how those who cause harm in the umbrella of sexual violence, under the umbrella of sexual violence, those who cause harm usually cause harm by, and if I put a blank at the end of that sentence, in a classroom, most of my students are going to say drugs and alcohol. And in a classroom full of teachers or school administrators, same thing, drugs and alcohol is usually the answer. And that's not to say that drugs and alcohol aren't used by those who cause harm to cause harm. They certainly are. But the number one way that harm is caused, especially in the realm of sexual violence, is through coercion. And we don't talk about it. We don't talk about it at all. And not only that, but we don't see it. What we see in popular culture is that it's okay. So for example, if, I can't tell you how many movies have the basis of their plot being that this young man is attracted to this young woman, and he asks her out on a date, and she says no. And the rest of the film is about him pursuing her until she gives in and says yes. And there's some romance kind of wrapped or warped around that storyline. But we see that in movie after movie after movie. We see that in television, in books, we see it everywhere. And so what we're learning from day to day is that men should pursue women. And that if someone says no, that just means we should push harder and try to convince them. And this is where we get into coercion. Coercion is about power and control. We are not believing someone's no. We hear the no, we understand they've said no, and we're continuing to push instead, and we're pushing onwards. So yeah, we're trying to gain a yes through manipulation. This is a really important conversation to have with youth, and it goes in a million different directions when I do. I'll give you guys an example of one that just kind of breaks my heart, and that was a young woman who said that she didn't want to, she wanted to be intimate with her partner, but she didn't want to have sex yet. She wasn't ready. She didn't feel like they were ready. And she was told by her partner that if she had sex or didn't have sex, it wouldn't matter. If she chose not to, that he would go to school the next day and tell everybody that she did, and tell everybody all the gory details of what it was like to have sex with her. And so this is the part that broke my heart. She's like, I don't think he was manipulating me. I think he just really wanted to have sex. And this is where coercion is insidious. And manipulation is, it's just so unfortunate. Mm-hmm. It breaks my heart. It does. Yeah.
I had a student one time, I asked, if somebody cares about their partner, they're in a relationship, they say they really care about this person or love them, why would they use coercion or try to control, or why would they harm their partner?
Right.
And this 14-year-old boy just looked at me and he goes, I think some people just want other people to do what they want.
Yep.
And that just hit home. I mean, just the way he was able to so succinctly summarize what takes people years to understand about coercion, like the why, but why, and it's that simple. Right. And it just reminds me of what the story you're sharing, that I think he just wanted to do something that he wanted to do that you did not. And that is the reason, and that is not about sex, that's about having that control.
Right.
That always sticks with me. I just wanted to add to that.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah. It's tough because sometimes when we're in the classroom with students, we're shifting their worldviews, right? Mm-hmm. For this young person, her worldview went from, I have this partner and occasionally we have sex when I don't want to my partner coerces and manipulates me in a way that is considered sexual violence, because it is sexual violence. And that can be tough. Yeah. But I think it's also really important, and I think it's important that we do this at home too. We have these conversations. Coercion can be about guilt trips, intimidation, threats of influence and control, and that is something that runs rampant in the hallways at the schools your children go to. And I don't say that to scare you. I say that to just drive home the point that yes, drugs and alcohol can be problematic, but coercion is something so worth talking about. If there's no equal power, then there's no consent, and that's just a full stop there. So, yeah, when someone knows the answer is no and they keep pushing, that's sexual violence, right? It is.
Even when it sounds nice, right? Even when it's, well, because I love you so much, you should do this for me. Or if you really care about me, this is what people who care about each other do. And it's this sneaky kind of coercion. It sounds a little nicer than I'm going to tell everyone at school,
right?
But it is still manipulation, and it's playing off of your emotions, and it's persuading you, pressuring you to try to, and it's leveraging the relationship. Sometimes I hear things like, oh, I didn't want to send my partner a nude photo of myself, but he said or she said that if I didn't, that he was going to find it somewhere else, or they were going to find it somewhere else. So I knew that that was a threat to my relationship, and I didn't want the relationship to be over. So I said yes, but it was not enthusiastic, and it was not
Freely given.
actually freely given,
Yeah.
right? It was coerced. And, we hear things like, I think a lesson that I heard a lot from adolescents when I was talking specifically with a group of girls was this idea that it will, like a partner, especially a male partner, saying to their female partner, if we stop now because we've gotten this far, it will be painful for me if you stop now and revoke your consent. And I heard that growing up. That was definitely something that was kind of in the, like, we just heard it. I don't know who first told me that, but it absolutely is kind of this myth that's out there. And a partner can leverage that for their control to say, well, you can't stop at this point because I will be in pain or this will be harmful to me. And who wants to hurt their partner?
Right.
So of course, okay, let's just keep going, even though I tried to revoke my consent. I did revoke my consent, but we kept going.
Yeah. And this is tricky. It's tricky in the moment. We talk about guilt trips too, and I'm glad that you're talking about the more subtle ones, because mine was very strong. But the more subtle ones, they sneak up on you, and then you start to guess later. Yeah. And I heard students last year, 2 students tell me that they had poor self-esteem, and they self-admitted this, and that their partner uses that against them and says, well, you're just lucky to have me. No one else would want you. Mm-hmm. And so they felt pressured into going further and faster, or to having sex more often than they wanted to. And at this age in particular, I mean, we all want to belong. We all want partners. We'd all like love in our life. But when you're in adolescence, those relationships are everything. They're everything. And so that manipulation, I think, is just even more possible when you're an adolescent.
Absolutely.
So, yeah. All right. I know that's heavy, but I think it's really important that we do talk about this. So a yes gained through manipulation or coercion is not voluntary, so it's not consent. You are not freely given your enthusiastic yes, so it's a no. And I think it's important that we teach people this too, because again, the pursuit of someone is something that we've seen glorified and romanticized all too often. And coercion and manipulation are basically power and control, forms of power and control. They don't allow for that voluntary choice. So it's important that we talk through this. So we've talked a little bit about consent now in its most basic forms. I just want to take a moment to say, and I know we talked about this earlier, but just as a quick reminder, that consent is a true binary. There is no in between. It's either an enthusiastic yes or it's a no. So anything that's maybe might be something that could be discussed at a different time, but in this moment, a maybe all the way to no. Anything that's not enthusiastic yes is no. So I think that's really important. Maybe means no in the moment. And of all the slides, this one's another tip. This one's the most important to me tonight as we talk. And that's because, again and again, in my experience with middle schoolers and high schoolers, when I'm at the schools, it's the students come up and talk, they want to talk about this slide. The teachers want to talk about this slide. The counselors want to talk about this slide. People often thank me for bringing this up because they feel that they've processed and reprocessed in their own mind situations that they have been in, romantic and intimate situations that they've been in, where they felt just so much pressure that they finally gave in. And that didn't feel right in their body, like somatically it just felt wrong, instinctively it was off. And so I want to take a moment to just pause at the slide and say, you've heard no means no, right? But I want to take that and expand it to say that no means no, absolutely. Maybe means no, we've talked about that. But no also doesn't mean convince me. No means no, right? And I think that that's just a really important point to make, again, because this, in movies and other social media and other forms of entertainment, we see again and again that no means convince me. And that's just really dangerous. We've been socialized into accepting that as real and true. I myself am a big geek and I love Star Wars, and there's this scene between Han Solo and Princess Leia where she either says no or pushes him away 6 or 7 times, and he still just keeps coming on. And I thought it was one of the most romantic scenes, and it just broke my heart of like, no, you can't have my Star Wars. But it's not consent. I mean, she's very clearly saying no, and he just keeps coming at her. And so we see this, we see it everywhere. And I'm not saying don't like Star Wars, because I still like Star Wars, but I'm saying that we need to be aware of it. And we need to be aware that this is the messaging that we've received our entire lives, and that no doesn't mean convince me. No means no, whether we see that reflected in our art and culture or not. To be very, very clear, sexual activity without consent, sexual activity with coercion and manipulation is sexual assault or rape. Just to be super clear about that. There's no getting around that. That is what it is. So no means no. It doesn't mean convince me. All right. So Julie.
So we've given a lot of what consent does not look like, what consent does not mean, what does not count as consent. So we're going to talk through what does consent sound like, and I think it's just very clear. So I would like to engage in informed, reciprocal, consensual sexual activities with you. Rolls right off the tongue, doesn't it?
Works every time, right?
Wow, that really sounds like a human wrote that, doesn't it? So, you know, we tease, and this is, I think, what sometimes when I talk to students, they're like, so this is what you want me to say? Like, you want me to make it this robotic, awkward thing? And it doesn't have to sound like this.
No.
And in fact, it rarely does. Just a quick story. I had I was doing a class with some students, and we were using a tool that we'll share. It's called coolnotcoolquiz.org, and it's really talks through some different scenarios. And one of the scenarios presented is, Alex and Shelby have been dating for 3 weeks, and after school, Alex asked Shelby is it okay if I kiss you? Mm. And the students vote with their thumbs up, thumbs down. Is that cool or not cool? And in this one class, this happens in most classes, but in this particular class, I'll just remember it forever. This student vehemently put that thumb way down. He's like, that is not cool. That's so awkward. And we all giggled, all the class kind of giggled. And but the majority of students had put that thumb very solidly up, this is cool. And so when we just kind of talked about it, I'm like, well, what's awkward about that? And he's like, that just feels so weird. It's not natural. It's not that flow. You just want to kind of ease into it, or just read those nonverbals, that kind of thing. The movie romanticized version, right, that we see where there's literally zero communication when kisses are about to happen or other kinds of touch, right? So we just, kind of asked him, well, what's more awkward? Is it more awkward to ask someone hey, is it okay if I kiss you? Or is it more awkward to say, accidentally kiss someone who doesn't want to be kissed? I say accident, but kiss someone who doesn't want to be kissed and you interpreted it wrong. How awkward would that be? Even harmful to your relationship. They might feel really upset about that, or at the very least, it's going to feel weird. It's going to be embarrassing or awkward if you kiss somebody that doesn't want to be kissed. And I didn't get into all that, but I just asked them to reflect on it. And they're like, yeah, that would be pretty awkward. And you could kind of see him looking around, and there were a few people who put their thumbs down, but he was real vehement, and kind of looking around, and all these other people in the class were like, no, it's not a big deal to just say, hey, is it okay if I kiss you now? And it was really cool to watch the other students who felt like that was maybe a little awkward or not as smooth and natural as it is on TV, to kind of go, oh, okay, I guess that is normal. I guess that is what people are expecting. And that was such a cool light bulb for me as an adult to go, whew, it was so different when I was young. And like, this is happening. Like, there is this kind of shift that's happening where more students in the class, a vast majority of students in the class, were like, oh no, that's normal and cool. And I just, so that was a kind of funny moment where he was kind of, oh, okay, I could see that would be awkward, more awkward the other way around, but also just cool to see that there is a shift in this conversation and normalization.
That's good news.
Yes.
That's very good news.
I took that as such. So let's talk about a little less of that legalese or that robot definition of consent, or what consent could sound like, and look at what does consent really sound like in real life, in real intimate interactions. So, we're going to just give you these words so that you can kind of practice them as a parent, so that you can kind of play around with them and this can feel really awkward, and we normalize that, and especially if you didn't have a role model or caregiver, somebody in your life who talked to you about what consent sounds like, or had these conversations where you could be open and ask those vulnerable questions. It's really hard to build that blueprint from scratch as that parent now. So, we're giving you some of these ideas and these, I love Eliza's quick tips for you to really, simmer on and practice on your own, and, maybe get a supportive adult that you're friends with, or a family member, or your partner, and you can kind of practice just saying some of these things out loud, kind of talking about these sometimes kind of awkward seeming things. And if it's not you, then maybe you're gonna have, somebody you care about who you do trust to have that conversation. And I know you had mentioned that you had a good role model in your life who helped you with that.
I did. I want to say that we teach our children how to say, may I have another glass? I would like this. We teach them how to ask for things, but we don't have any cultural examples of what it sounds like, because usually sex scenes are about sounds and not about words. We don't have the comprehensive sex education that we could have in our schools, and so a lot of our children are learning about sex from porn. It's just true. There's not a lot of talk in porn. And so if we're saying that consent is about communication, and we're not teaching them what to say, and they've never even heard an adult say, these are the sorts of things you say in the intimate moments when you're kissing, or when you're touching, or when you're wanting to go further, like, how are we expecting them to just know these things? Like, we don't teach it at all, and there are no examples. There's so few examples, I should say. So I think it's important. Now, my parents really didn't want to have this particular conversation with me, to Julie's point. And one of the things that we want to give you as a tip is, yes, practice with your best friend before you have this conversation with your adolescent. Practice with your partner, maybe, before you have this conversation with your adolescent. But my parents chose a different route, and that was totally okay. So I want you to know that it is. And that was that my Aunt Sue told me about these things. We went out to dinner and had a very awkward conversation at first, but what ended up being really honest and transparent, and there was tremendous amounts of laughter, in which she shared some of her more awkward, intimate moments. And then we talked about what it sounds like to communicate with someone while you're having sex or while you're making out. And I will forever be grateful to my parents for just admitting that that was beyond the scope of awkward for them, and for them to find an askable adult, someone I trusted, that they trusted, to have that conversation with me, and that was my Aunt Sue, who I'm also deeply grateful for, and we still laughed about that years later. But it was great, and I feel very lucky that I had that person in my life to have that conversation with me. So I just want you to know as a parent that you can practice with other people, and if Even if that feels too awkward, this is an important conversation to have, and if it needs to be another trusted family member or friend, then that's okay too. Yeah, that's okay too.
I appreciate that. And I know just so many folks as adults, like we just didn't even have that at all.
Yeah.
We didn't have an Aunt Sue.
I was lucky, yes.
And I just see how like so many models, especially I can only speak as a cis female, like that's how I grew up. And, you know, but I know that there was this feeling of like, I have to be cool.
Right.
And it would be, you don't, as a young girl, I didn't want to appear like I was interested in anything sexual, right? So I love just giving some specific language around what can consent look like and sound like that is normal, and doesn't have to be this, like, you don't have to be silent and cool about it. You can say what you want, and you should say what you want, and it's going to make it a better connection. So things like, do you want to have sex? Just clearly articulating that. Even, you know, we talked about kissing, like, is it okay if I kiss you? Are you interested in having sex? Are you comfortable right now? Checking in like that. Will you do this to me? And that's one that just, I could go on and on about, because especially as a female, I never heard that you're allowed to ask for things that you want.
Amen.
Ugh, and the power of that and the connection that you can, you know, create when it is okay to say, hey, I might like this, or can we try this? Will you do this? Are you sure you're ready for this? Giving that opportunity to really check in with that person. And I think that that's good language to use when you might be sensing some of that hesitation in a partner, or you're noticing a lack of verbalization or communication. We can take on the responsibility to say, are you sure you're ready for this? Or are you comfortable? Is this okay? When you're not getting that response. And then, what would you like to experience? What's interesting for you? Do you want to try this? Do you want to try blank? How far do you want to go? Let's set some boundaries in advance. And that's like, you know, next level consent here, when we actually are saying, this is the boundary, and this is, I trust you enough to say, this is what I want, and this is, you know, what's comfortable for me. And the trust to say, okay, I'm going to honor your boundary, and like that is how we build that trust too over time. We can stop at any time. Just the power of that statement, when we may never have heard anything like that before. Do you want to go further? Checking in when things are transitioning, or when, you know, when you're changing the kind of type or degree of the sexual activity. Is this okay? Do you want to go further? We can stop at any time. Can be really, it gives those tangible moments to keep building in that verbal communication. And if you're not into this, we could do this instead. Would you be open to that? Oops. So just wanted to give some tangible examples of what, in these intimate interactions, what consent communication can really sound like. We don't have to be robots. It can be really natural, and you can, again, like the more we practice saying these out loud, you'll feel more empowered to share those with your young people, or your, you know, talk to your college students about this too, you know, give those tangible examples, because like Eliza said, we never really hear those examples in popular culture, in our media. So I just appreciate giving these real solid words that we can practice.
Absolutely. I think it will make a very big difference in the quality of intimate interactions your child has. And I want to say too, as a bisexual woman, I'd just like to take a moment to put this in context, in a kind of queer context. And that's that if you have a child who is LGBTQIA+, these questions are important, but there are also other questions as two people of the same sex interact. For example, there's not a lot of information out there about what that kind of sex looks like. And so your LGBTQIA+ child may need additional resources. So asking those questions to them. Do you know what sex looks like between two women? Do you know what sex looks like between two men? Did you have questions along those lines? Can we can we look into that together as potentially awkward as that may be? I think that would be so welcomed. But also that there are more questions on this list for people who are LGBTQA+. And that's like, so I heard people do this. Have you heard that? And so there's some other questions that kind of come into play when we're talking about queer kids. So consent is a skill we can foster, right? This is what we promised we would come around to at the end of the conversation, and that is that consent is something that we all, as individuals, need to foster within ourselves. And at the end of this list, under personal skills, you see self-esteem, and I really think that consent and self-esteem move together. They move together because self-esteem is about having agency, feeling like your voice is important and matters, feeling like your opinion matters. And all of that ties into the skill of being able to say, this is what I want, this is what I don't want. This is what I wanted yesterday, and today it might be different. All of that comes down to agency and choice, and that has to do with self-esteem. So as a parent, when you're thinking about, how can I model this for my child? Especially for those parents out there who are thinking, I never had any of this modeled for me, how do I model it? Part of it is checking in with yourself about your own self-esteem and your own use of agency and where you can build opportunities in your day-to-day, moment-to-moment, whether you're with your child or not, to really build the intuition within yourself to know when your yes is an enthusiastic yes, your yes is a coerced or manipulated yes, just really being present with these ideas that we've discussed tonight so that you can become more aware of what your own agency level is and how you might amplify that. And what this idea of self-esteem and how that ties into choice and how that ties into consent looks like. Now on an interpersonal skill level, this is where we're giving people the gift of consent and we're asking. So we can all do better at this too. We can all ask more. Is this okay? Is that okay? What would you like to do? What would that look like to you? How would that feel if we did this? In the most simple everyday scenarios. And by doing that, you're modeling that for your friends, your family, your coworkers, and most importantly, your children. You're modeling that. Next time you take a picture of your child, ask first or ask them how they'd like to be involved. Like, I'd really like to take a picture to memorialize this moment. Would you like to be the director? Would you like to be behind the camera, in front of the camera? Should we take a selfie? What do you think, right? Opening up choice and agency, giving them the choice to have a voice in that. And if they say, I don't really feel like taking a picture right now, even if that's, maybe disappointing to you, just respecting that. Respecting their no's. Anytime you can respect someone's no, whether that, again, is a coworker or a family member, but especially if it's your child. I think the example that we see over and over again is the end of Thanksgiving. It's the end of Thanksgiving. Everybody's kind of leaving. Folks are starting to leave. Uncle Fred wants a hug. And very often you will hear the parents say, now go give Uncle Fred a hug. And the better, proper way of doing that is to ask the child, would you like to give Uncle Fred a hug? Or would you prefer a fist pump or a shake or just to wave goodbye today? Like what feels right? Or maybe anticipating that whole end of Thanksgiving scenario and just letting your child know, hey, tonight when Thanksgiving's over and everybody starts to leave, it's up to you if you want to give hugs and kisses or if you want to give fist pumps or if none of that feels okay tonight. That's all up to you. That builds agency in your child. It builds skill in your child. It teaches them to understand their own intuition about what feels comfortable and what doesn't feel comfortable. It teaches them that they're in charge of what happens to their body, that they get to have a voice and a say about what happens to their body. And 10 years later, when they're kissing someone at the football game, they'll have built up this incredible skill of knowing what they want and what they don't want and how to ask for that and how to say yes and say no. But it doesn't come without practice. So we need to practice as adults and we need to model it for our children. And we're going to make some mistakes along the way. And that's okay too. So yeah, Julie, what would you add?
I just was thinking about the added level of connection and trust when you show your child and actually say, hey, Eliza, do you want to give Uncle Fred a hug or would you rather give him a fist bump or a high five or a wave? And, the child says, No, just a wave, just a wave. They're all shy. That's my shy kid imitation. And Uncle Fred's like, oh, come on, right? Because we love hugging kids, and sometimes it's normalized. Not that
Right.
Uncle Fred's a bad guy, but that's a normal response I've seen from family. Like, oh, come on, give me a hug. And then for me as the parent to say, Uncle Fred, she said no, she'd rather give you a wave. So we're just going to do waves tonight. And just the added level of empowerment that child is like, my parent has my back. My caregiver is amplifying my little voice. And so when I'm at the football stadium 10 years later and I get, this uncomfortable interaction happens, or I feel like this didn't go the way I wanted it to go, or somebody was pushing my boundaries, I'm going to remember that I can talk to my parent about that. So it's building that skill, and it's building that trust, and what an incredible way to advocate for your child in kind of a small way.
Yeah.
And I've even seen, recently I saw a friend got copied on a text from their family members, and it said, hey, we've noticed a lot of people hugging the little kids and our 3 little ones, and we just wanted to send a family text to just let you know that we're really talking a lot about consent to our kids. And so when you do come over next time, we are really working to ask, like, do you want a high five? Do you want a hug? Do you want a kiss? Do you want a fist bump? Like,
Right.
And it was like taking it all to the next level to say, hey, it's not just the child's responsibility to, although that empowerment piece is absolutely key, it's also we as adults can work to model those boundaries and set healthy boundaries there too.
And reinforce their choices.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I love that. Thank you for sharing. All right, so a big question, a discussion question for us. How might you teach and build the skill of consent in your family and communities? We've already given some examples. We talked about modeling it. We've talked about normalizing consent. We've talked about expecting consent, and about using examples that we might stumble across, like while we're playing a video game with a child, while we're watching a movie or a TV show with a child. Either in the moment or the next day on the car ride to school, discussing what we saw. Those are all ways that we can kind of build and teach consent within our family. In our communities, it could be as simple as knocking on that office door before you just barge into your coworker who you've worked with for 10 years, things like that. But in the end, for me, it comes down to consent and compromise, asking questions, being curious. Curious is so important. And it's not something we've mentioned tonight, but I think it's an important element of this. And ultimately comes down to compassion, like really wanting those around us to have choice, and wanting to have choice ourselves. But I'd like to get into more specifics. So Julie, I'm wondering, do you have another specific example of how we might build this skill?
Yeah, I think something that, when I think about building the skill, I'm always thinking about the youngest kiddos to start there. And because I think parents tonight might be watching like, okay, I've got middle schoolers and high schoolers, and I can kind of see where this fits in, talking about intimate interactions and things like that. But what about my, toddler? What about my preschooler? And so I always like, when I think about building, it starts as young as when you're watching this video. So with the youngest ones, one of the biggest things that we really talk about in our kind of prevention conversations is teaching kids about their guiding voice, that sense of empowerment. How do I notice when something is icky, when something doesn't feel right, when I want something? Like, what does that feel like in my body? And starting with those youngest kiddos to say, you're presenting 2 options, and they're going, yes, I want this. This is what I want. And you're going, how do you know? What does that feel like? Where do you feel that, like, you want that movie instead of this movie, or this book instead of that book? And even like helping kids come up with language for it. So I feel it in my heart. It's like a pink feeling in my heart, and like giving that kind of language. Or I know some parents that just talk with their kids about that gut feeling or that gut instinct, and helping them identify that in little choices and big decisions too. And so as that skill gets older, or as kids get older and enhance that skill, we can say to our middle schooler, or any elementary age kid too, like what, you know, I know you're wrestling with this decision. You're not sure if you want to do softball this season or if you want to do keep playing soccer. And I know that's a really big deal for you. And so let's normalize just taking a moment to be quiet or to write out our thoughts or to just kind of notice what we're feeling when I think about soccer. Notice what I feel, what I feel and where I feel it when I think about softball. Not playing softball, not playing soccer, and just normalizing that decision making of checking in with our instincts, that gut choice, and then, you know, really helping, like you said, reinforce that and say, okay, I'm not going to push my child. I'm not going to try to persuade them, even though I really would rather watch soccer than softball, right? But really to reinforce that and say, I'm really proud of you. You really checked with your gut instinct, and that's, you know, the choice we'll make. And if that changes, that's okay too, but we'll, you know, navigate that. So I just really think about the first kind of building block for me is thinking about that sense of empowerment and how do I even know what I want? And that's something I hear from adults all the time. Like, I didn't ever know what my personal preferences were or what, you know, what I really wanted. And so I think starting early and having conversations about that gut instinct or that guiding voice and really reinforcing that.
I love that. I like your, it felt like pink in my heart.
Yeah.
That's just so sweet.
Or that red feeling in my stomach.
Yeah.
Like, you know, just, I hear parents using that with their kids when they've built that communication, because kids might not say, oh, you know, that doesn't feel right to me, you know, when they're preschoolers or toddlers, but to say, I have that red tummy feeling, and that is language to give for that. That probably means that it's a stop sign, or that's probably a moment where you're going to say no, and we're going to look at a different option. So just making it tangible.
Yeah, we've talked about empowerment, and now you're also adding, what I hear you saying is embodiment of that empowerment, which serves us in so many different ways, and really comes down to mindfulness. And if we can build that in our children, then that's just a lovely thing. My idea is a riff off one of yours, and that is writing. I loved writing when I was a kid. Even when I was in like second grade, I loved to write. And so being able to journal about something. And this works in the moment sometimes. You know, obviously it depends on how timely a decision is. Like, you can't always be like, pardon me while I sit down and write about this, or excuse me while I make a top 10 list of why I should and shouldn't do this. But sometimes it helps in reflection, because sometimes as adults, as the caring adults, as the askable adults, as the parents, children are coming to us, youth are coming to us and telling us about something that happened last night, happened over the weekend, happened in the hallway, whatever it might be. So reflection, written reflection, can be very, very powerful. And it just depends on your child. You know your child best. For some children, and this would be another close friend of mine, her son, it's playing tennis. So like if he's got a big decision he needs to make and his emotions feel really jumbly, which is a word he'll use sometimes, I just feel jumbly inside, he'll go out on the court and play and play and play until suddenly it doesn't feel so jumbly anymore. And so it just depends on your child. If I were your child, it would be about papers and pens and gel markers and and me doodling and writing and making lists. And for another child, it might be bouncing a tennis ball off a brick wall for a few hours, or going out on the court and playing a couple games. But I think that that's important too, so that we have skills that we can use in the moment while we have to make a decision in the moment, and then also ways that we can reflect back on things that happened, so that we can maybe make different choices in the future. And that's where writing and exercise and things like that can come to play. So yeah. Anything else that you'd add to this conversation?
Yeah, I know we've said it several different ways, but to reinforce the consent in those little, big and little ways, like throughout your day-to-day with your kids. And I think it's things like, oh, can I scoot your chair in for you? Like, can I come into your physical space? Like, I hear parents doing that naturally, hey, do you want to give daddy a kiss or give mommy a hug? Like, those are questions we ask, and I hear parents doing that kind of naturally, and I think that just kind of expanding on that and bringing that into lots of ways that you can do that with a kiddo. Would you rather, sit on my lap, or do you want to sit on your own chair? Just offering those small options and showing that it's okay. This is a big key, that it's okay, and I won't guilt trip you if you decide to sit in your own chair, or that, if you say, no, I don't want to hug.
There won't be consequences.
There won't be consequences.
Right.
And to go, all right, that's okay. And I think that's a really big key here, and that takes our own work too. And I think that this whole conversation too, I just want to say, if it did bring things up for you, you're not alone, and that you can use this as a kind of jumping off point to get some support for your own self. I've definitely seen where parents might kind of take their own experiences and then kind of just say, well, that's just what it is to be, a girl in this world. And it's sort of like, you kind of pass off your own stuff if we don't really face it and deal with it. And if this kind of stuff is coming up for you, it's a good idea to get some support, because we can sometimes inadvertently pass on messages that we've learned that were maybe unhealthy or weren't informed consent, without, kind of facing that and seeing what we've got under the surface.
I'm glad you brought that up.
Support.
Yeah. And we're here to support you too. We'll have a list of resources. Sarnco's always here if you need someone to talk, or if you're looking for resources for yourself or for your children. And there are lots of other resources too. So speaking of which, we have a couple resources listed here. I'll talk about Darkness to Light, and then I'll hand it off to you to talk about Cool, Not Cool. So Darkness to Light is an incredible organization. I recommend them for many reasons, but they do on their website have a lot of really great tools. Their focus is on prevention of childhood sexual assault, but they have a lot of really great tools around consent and talking to your kids about X and Y. So I recommend them, and their website is www.d2l.org. So that's Darkness to Light. They may have resources that can help you have these conversations. All right, cool, not cool.
And for those maybe middle to high school age children, I think Cool Not Cool is a great resource too. One that we use in classroom settings, and also with, in youth groups and after school programs and one-on-ones with adolescents. When you go to www.that'snotcool.com, you'll find a parent ally or an adult ally section, and then a young person section. And so I recommend exploring both, but it's cool, like if you give yourself time to look through it first and then share it with your young person, it's a great way to generate some of these kind of conversations that we've been having, but with really tangible scenarios. So if you're like, we usually avoid a lot of TV and movies, so I don't know that we're going to run into that many examples in popular media or something like that. Maybe this is another way to bring in some of those tangible examples. So they'll give different scenarios, like I mentioned. Alex has been dating Shelby, and he asked her if it's okay to kiss her, and some of those are cool. But then they'll also give some scenarios that are meant to elicit that kind of not cool response, and that in the adult ally section gives you an opportunity to get some ideas about how to say, well, what's not cool about that, or to kind of guide that discussion. So it's not, you don't have to just make it up all on your own or feel like you're all alone in this navigating adolescence. So I really like that resource, and I encourage parents and guardians, and also your young people, to check that out.
I love that website. You're the one who turned me on to that. I appreciate it. Because, like you said, it has the resources for both, and it kind of empowers you to be that caring adult and have these kinds of conversations. But one of the things that I liked about it was, gosh, what was I going to say? Cool, not cool. Oh, is that it really
like normalizes.
Thank you.
Kind
Normalizes is a good word. I'm sorry. Frames it. It frames it in a sense of curiosity.
Yes.
So like as the adult, you're going to ask if it's cool or not cool, and if they say cool and you're like, that's not cool. To approach it with curiosity rather than being like, what do you mean? So that you can open up a conversation and that conversation can blossom and continue to open. And I liked that too. So if you struggle where you're like, I would have a hard time having a conversation with my child because is it cool or not cool is going to lead to me being super judgmental if they get it wrong, then this website will help you because it really does approach the adult part of these conversations from a point of curiosity and helps you kind of know what to ask next so you don't stifle the conversation but instead create an atmosphere of curiosity and generation. So
I love that.
I love that about that. Next one is something I mentioned earlier. It's a cup of tea analogy video. This one is 3 minutes long. It's super powerful. It's slightly sarcastic, but super powerful. There'll be other ones out there too that have to do with like ordering pizza, but this cup of tea analogy video is still a favorite for me. 3 minutes long, and what you want to do is just a simple Google search of consent, tea, and clean, because there's a version that's clean and a version that has swearing. So if you'd like to avoid the one with swear words, then you want to add the word clean in there. So.
Good point.
Yeah. And the last one is RAIN. RAIN is kind of the National Rape Crisis Center, if you would. We're, for example, Sarnco is an affiliate of RAIN, and they have a beautiful page of definitions and explanations and articles about consent that breaks down kind of what we talked about today in even more detail. So if you're interested in reading more from a scholarly perspective, an intellectual perspective on this topic, then I think RAIN does a really nice job of doing that without putting you to sleep. So rain.org would be my last resource suggestion. There are more than this, but these are just some that we wanted to offer to you in tonight's broadcast. Anything else that you would add? No? All right, very good. Well then, we want to thank you for attending tonight's seminar. Again, to Julie's point before, this may have you rewriting your own history a bit. This may have you thinking about scenarios from your past or even your present. We want you to know that you have our support. If you need support as an individual, or if you feel like you want additional resources for helping your child, we're here to support you. So please don't hesitate to reach out to our 24-hour Sarnco helpline at 614-267-7020. Again, we've also created a document with all the various school district contact information. So if you'd like resources within your school district, just scan the QR code on your screen and you'll have that document. And finally, we hope that you found value, knowledge, and inspiration in this session. There are several other sessions if you're interested in watching on the YouTube channel. And thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your evening.